Picture this. A mysterious stranger rides into town wearing a black hat. How can we tell if he means to cause trouble or to restore order to the town? We've heard the stories about men who wear black hats, but sometimes the only way to tell if a man is good or bad is through their actions. So let us see if this black-hatted speaker is going to cause trouble or not. And welcome on stage, Ivor Tymchak.
Thank you, Royd. You are what you believe, and you believe the stories that you're told. So this talk is designed to impress upon you how your world is fashioned, bless you, by powerful stories. And I also hope you'll learn how you can make your messages sticky with stories. Because if your messages aren't sticky, your audience aren't going to act on them, which is what you want them to do when you've given a talk. So I'm going to start with a story. And we need to go back in time, the 1840s, to Vienna. And we're outside the General Hospital. It's a teaching hospital, so it's free. So the patients tend to be poor, and a typical patient might be a prostitute that's become pregnant. So it's got a maternity wing, and the wing is divided into two wards. One is run by full-time midwives, and the other is run by doctors and their students. But such is the reputation of one of the wards that the women, when they turn up, if they turn up on the wrong day, because admission is on alternate days, they would rather give birth in the street than enter this ward. The ward they fear is the one run by doctors and their students. It has a death rate of up to 5 times higher than the one run by the midwives. And this is common knowledge throughout the hospital and the surrounding area. Now, the director of the hospital is a chap called Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, he's the bloke we're interested in. He's a Hungarian Jew. He's very sharp, very clever. He's meticulous. His interpersonal skills aren't that great. You might almost say he was autistic in today's kind of environment. But he's curious about why there's this discrepancy in this death rate. Now, the deaths are attributed to what they call childbed fever. It wasn't complications in the birth. They called it childbed fever. We know it today as sepsis. So he was intrigued by this death, and he's presented with a unique opportunity because he's got an almost perfect scientific experiment before the scientific method was developed. Because he knew that he had a control group and a variable. Because both wards shared same air, same food, same water. So he knew it had to be a man-made cause that was creating this discrepancy. So he started to investigate what might be going on. And he noticed that the doctors used a different position for the women to give birth in than the one used by the midwives. So he instructed the doctors to change the position that they used to match the one used by the midwives. No change in the death rate. He then noticed that a priest does his rounds in the wards, rings his bell in the doctor's ward, but not in the midwife's ward. So he instructs the priest not to ring his bell in either ward. No change in the death rate. Now that gives you a clue at the level of medical knowledge at that time. People thought disease was caused by miasma, bad air, and that you had 4 humours. So a disease was unique to you. Only you could have that disease. So Semmelweis thought, no, there's something else going on. He was guessing at what might be going on, which is interesting, actually, that that's how all science operates, all of it. Someone notices a phenomenon, thinks, that's interesting, what's causing that? Don't know, I'll guess. I'll have to create experiments to find out what's going on. That's how it works. Then Semmelweis got a breakthrough. his close friend at the hospital died. And he died when one of his students, he was doing an autopsy on one of the dead women. One of the students just nicked him with the scalpel. And he died of exactly the same symptoms that the women died from childbed fever. And Semmelweis thought, this suggests the disease is communicable, which was unheard of at that time. This was like a new theory. So he thought, okay, I will study what the doctors do closely to see what's going on. So he observed them very closely, and he noticed that generally in the morning they would do autopsies on the women who died the night before, and they would do the autopsies barehanded. So they would put their hands into the organs, into the womb or whatever, because it's a teaching hospital, showing the students the anatomy and that kind of thing. And then in the afternoon, they would typically go into the maternity ward to examine women and help deliver babies barehanded. So this made Semmelweis think that maybe these cadaverous particles of some kind being transmitted from the dead women to the live women. Now he was guessing, but he thought, let's experiment, let's try and interrupt that transmission if there is one. What could be done to interrupt it? And he came up with the idea of hand washing before the doctors went into the ward. And instead of just using soap and water, he thought, let's make it a bit stronger than that. So he came up with a chlorinated lime solution. Now it chose chlorine largely for its ability to dispel the smell of putrefying flesh. But as luck would have it, chlorine is one of the best antiseptics we have. Still is. So as soon as he introduced this regime and told the doctors to wash their hands before they entered the ward, the results were dramatic. Death rate plummeted to 0 in some weeks. Semmelweis knew he was onto something here. Definitely something going on. Now this is where it all started to go wrong for Semmelweis, because he was a data guy. He had the data. The data was unequivocal. There it is. But he wasn't very good at socializing or telling stories, basically. So he didn't publish papers about his findings. He wouldn't give talks about it. He just had the data. And the biggest crime was that he didn't have an explanation for why it was working. He just knew that it worked, couldn't explain why. Now this caused resentment from the doctors, because they were educated gentlemen, high status, and the current belief was disease was caused by miasma. And the implication of having to wash their hands before they entered the ward was that they were dirty. They didn't like that. But Semmelweis was insistent, no, you wash your hands because the data says this. So there was this resentment between the doctors and Semmelweis. And then there was various political changes that happened around this time. It was quite complicated, but the eventuality was that Semmelweis lost his job. He was offered the job, but under such humiliating circumstances, he couldn't possibly accept it. So he left. And as soon as he left, the doctors reverted back to their previous habits. They stopped the hand-washing regime. And so the death rate just returned to its former level. Now, when I first came across this story, this is where it got fascinating for me. Because I thought, wait a minute, these are educated, privileged men who were intelligent, who could see the data. Why didn't they respond to it? Every time they were going into the ward to examine a woman, they were effectively passing a death sentence on them. And they knew it, and they'd taken the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. How did that work? And after much thought, the only explanation I could come up with was that the story they had about themselves was more powerful than the data. So they told themselves that they were the experts in the field, they were privileged people, the consensus was, the disease was blah, blah. The data was inconvenient, but their story about themselves was more powerful than the data. Now, Semmelweis, he got really annoyed by all this, and he started to write angry letters to the administrators of the hospital, accusing them of being murderers. That's kind of the level he was operating at. Now, had he had better social skills, been a better communicator, he might have come up with a way of working with the doctors. So if he'd have said to them, look, we've discovered something really important here. If you work with me, we might be able to discover what the mechanism is that's causing this transmission. And you then will become famous. You will go down in history as one of the discoverers of what is going on. And he would have told the story that they understood. The doctor would have thought, yes, actually, yes. I'd be interested in that happening. And he would have worked with them. Or he could have used emotional blackmail. He could have said, imagine it was your daughter going into the ward to give birth. You'd want to give them every chance of survival, wouldn't you? Even if you thought it was superstition, you'd think, no, we'll use that, we'll go with that. But he didn't do any of that. And so countless lives were lost as a result of people abandoning the hand-washing regime. Just to complete the story, Semmelweis became obsessed with the whole sepsis thing. His behaviour became more erratic. His wife reported that his sexual behaviour became odd. The theory is that he was suffering from either Alzheimer's or third-stage syphilis because he was examining so many pregnant women, prostitutes and what have you. And eventually he was committed to an asylum. And he still had lucid days, and after a month of being there, he sort of became aware of what was happening to him. He tried to escape, and when they captured him, he sustained an injury, which became infected, and he died of sepsis, the very thing he was obsessed with. So it's ironic that his life story provides this great example of why you should tell stories and not data. So there's a story of how a story could have saved lives. Now, generally, when you say to people, tell stories, not data, and they think about stories, they just imagine sort of campfire stories. Or, mate down at the pub, oh, he told this story, which belittles stories. Stories are far more powerful than that. All your lives are controlled by stories. All of civilization cannot function without certain stories. That's how powerful they are. I can imagine you all thinking now, come on, Ivor, then give us some examples. Here's one. Money. What a story that is. But if you think about it logically, right, you go into a store, you've got this plastic sheet, this worthless plastic sheet now, and you hand it over to the chap in the store, and he gives you coffee and donuts, or whatever, for this worthless piece of plastic. How does that work? It only works because the storekeeper knows, there's a story behind this sheet of plastic that you can exchange things for it, for goods and services. So he believes the story. And if enough people believe the story, it'll work. And it'll carry on. I mean, it's even worse when you think about when you go for a mortgage, you apply for a mortgage and the bank manager or the building society says, yeah, you can have that. Here's £100,000. Types it into a computer. There it is. There's your magic money tree if you want one. It's created out of nothing, literally. It's a story. There it is. These digits, that means you can spend £100,000. Another one is nationalism. Depending on where you are born on the planet, defines your cultural identity, strangely. In some places, it's an arbitrary line drawn on a map. And yet, if you're born on one side or the other, somehow you acquire this national identity. Another one, land ownership. I love this one. You can't own land. It's impossible. You can defend territory, but you can't own land. You might say, this is my patch of land. And if somebody else comes along who's more powerful than you, got a bigger gang, you're off. So we've invented this story of the law. We have this thing called the law, which means that there's this gang somewhere else that will sort anyone else who thinks they're going to take away. Can you see the absurdity in it? It's a story to allow civilization to continue. That's how powerful they are. Here's a little example. Now, what if I was to tell you that the red pill made you a success and the blue pill made you a failure? Which would you choose?
The red one.
The red one to be a success. Now, what if I told you that the ingredients of both pills are exactly the same? It's a rhetorical question, don't worry. The point I was making there, of course, is that success and failure are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. Every entrepreneur has to have failures before they have the success. But by using that little device, that little story, it's made the idea sticky. It even evokes the film The Matrix, where I've sort of drawn that quote from, which makes it even stickier. So there's an example of how, if you've got a message or some data, you think, this is important, I need to attach a story to it, then you can quite easily find something that you can stick on it. Now, there is hard science behind stories working. You're all data people, I take it. Well, there is hard science. You know, they've looked at the brain and a vast amount of it is given over to the visual cortex. We're visual people. Most of our stimulus is from visuals. So when someone tells you a story, what happens is various parts of your brain fire up that responds to the narrative. And because so many different parts of the brain fire up, it's actually easier to remember a story than anything else. If I give you a datum, only one part of the brain fires up and easily gets forgotten. So there's hard science there. Stories work. They will work for you. That's how memory champions do their skill. That's how they operate. Memory champions are given a list of things to remember, and they have to remember these items in a particular order. And the technique, does anybody know the technique of memories? Yeah. What they do is they just create a narrative of all these items, however they've trained their mind to do it. So it might be that they go through all the rooms in their house, and then they go through into the hall, and there's a telephone. So one of the items might be a telephone. Then they go into the living room, and they switch on the TV. So it's a TV that's, etc., etc., etc. So then when they have to recall the items, they just go through the story, and they can remember each item in the order that they're supposed to. So they actually use the technique for remembering things. Don't just think stories are when you're on stage giving your presentation. Start to think beyond that remit. I've got another little story which illustrates that. Last year I gave a talk for Wakefield Business Week, and it was a free event. I was just going to talk for an hour about presenting with impact. That was the title. So they promoted it, and about 30 odd people turned up for the event. And I didn't know anybody in this room, because people signed up from all around the region, and they turned up in the room, and I was just chatting with people, getting to know them, whatever. And after the event, I emailed everyone and said, would you mind giving me some feedback on what you thought of the session? Because, of course, I want to improve all the time, and as I'm sure you do as well. So I got lots of emails back, and there was one in particular stuck in my mind. You might have noticed the hat that I'm wearing, and that's sort of part of my branding. Normally, it's the hat, a hot pink coloured shirt, black trousers. That's kind of my brand. And that's what I was wearing on the day. And this woman said, when she turned up for the event, she didn't know anyone in the room. But as soon as she walked into the room and she saw me, she knew I had to be the presenter. Because there's nobody else who stood out that much. And she said she could have turned around there and then gone back to work, and she would have got enormous benefit from just that one incident. Because it was about presenting with impact. So I like to make an impact before I come on stage. If I'm in a room, I'll dress outrageously, not outrageously, but within the comfort zone of the people there, but just enough for them to think, who's that guy? So I'm starting the story outside of the stage. And you can think about that as well. Think about all the social media. If you've got a talk coming up somewhere, an important message, think about the story that you might attach to it to make it sticky, and where you might put it on social media or start spreading something so that people are talking about it before you even get on stage. That's what you need to do. And of course, if you've got lots of stories that are easy to remember, that's useful for you, because then you can improvise where need be. So I'm going to finish off with a story about the tech off. Has anybody heard of the tech off? It happened a couple of months ago. I got a text message from Royd on the day of the event, and he said, "Oh, hi, Ivor, I'm going to this event tonight. You might be interested. Here's a link." So I looked at the link, and I looked at the sort of promotional stuff, and it looked like a wrestling event. One of these wrestling federations. There were lots of costumes and outrageous this, that, and the characters. And I thought, what, wrestling? And then there was but talk seemed to be interspersed with the wrestling. I thought, well, if this talks, I'm interested, because I'm always learning from watching other presenters. So I thought, I'll go along. So I went along, and when I arrived at Belgrave in Leeds, where it was, the place was buzzing. There's like 200 odd people in there, lots of music, loud music, playing outrageously costumed DJ on the stage, all this kind of thing. And I quickly realised that there wasn't any wrestling. They'd simply used the imagery of wrestling for the event. It was a spoken word event. They'd made their event sticky by using the imagery of wrestling. So people could think, I went to this, wrestling was it was a tech-off thing. That was it. Anyway, the setup was that coders were competing against creatives. They were given 5 minutes each, and there were 4 bouts. So in the first bout, a creative would compete against a coder. They would take it in turns, have 5 minutes, give their talk to try and justify why they were more important than the other person, and then there'd be a clap-off, and the audience would choose their favourite. And then the 4 winners would go on to the ultimate clap-off, so for the champion thing. Anyway, so the event started, and the MC announced that one of the creatives hadn't turned up. So there was a wild card available if anyone was stupid enough, brave enough, drunk enough to speak. Now, I teach presentation skills. That's what I do. And one of the things I always tell the people who come to the workshops is that if you get an opportunity to speak, take it. Because that's the only way you're going to improve. Like anything, you have to put in the practice. So I was thinking, here's an opportunity to speak. 200 odd people, it looks like. I mean, the MC was starting to wind them up a bit and get them to shout out and what have you, so it was pretty wild, but I thought, no, this would be an interesting challenge. I'll volunteer. So I volunteered to do one of the sessions. Now, I was fortunate enough that my bout was the very last one. So I could watch the previous 3 and see what they did. Now, they all had their slides, and they gave their presentations. After 4 minutes, 2 security guards came onto the stage and stood by them threateningly, so they had a minute to wrap up, etc. So I thought, okay. But none of them seemed to tell a story. It was all kind of this, that, and then this happened, and that happened, and here's some data, and here's an image, here's a quote. So I thought, okay, I could tell a story. And I thought that the Semmelweis story would fit this, because it's a tech event. And the Semmelweis story talks about data. That would work. And I also run an event called the Better Culture event, which has a similar format. You've got 5 minutes to give a presentation. And I'd given the Better Culture talk at the Better Culture, Semmelweis talk at the Better Culture event. So I knew it would fit 5 minutes. Thought, that's what I'll do. So then my turn came. I went on stage. I had no preparation, no slides, just told the story of Semmelweis. And I was getting a response from the audience. I thought, yes, they're following this. But instead of just finishing the story as I did tonight, it suddenly occurred to me that this would be an opportunity to improvise a different ending, because the way they'd set it up, it was adversarial. It was competing, one against the other. And like the blue pill and the red pill, that's not how it works. You need collaboration, not competition. So I just said, no, instead of competing, why don't we collaborate? And that way we can combine our forces and change the world, or whatever. Anyway, it went down quite well. well enough to win the bout. So I managed to get through to the 4 sort of people at the end on the stage, and then there was a final clap-off. And I won the championship. Here it is. This is what they awarded me with. So anyway, that's just a self-aggrandizing story, but it just demonstrates that if you've got a pocket full of stories that are varying lengths, you think, oh, yeah, that makes a point. If you get an opportunity, if somebody says, oh, team meeting or whatever, has anybody got anything? I've got a story to drive home the message, then you can deliver it. So whether you're speaking at a team meeting or a massive conference, think about, how can I make my message sticky? And make it sticky with emotion. Because emotion is the fuel for passion. So if you've got an entire audience that is pumped up with passion, you can change the world with that. Thank you very much for listening.